As a Cobble Aboriginal woman from the Barringam Nation in southwest Queensland, I'd like to thank, where is Auntie Zita sitting? Hi, thank you. That was a really beautiful, very powerful welcome to country. Thank you. I can't really see, I'm short too. And I pay my respects to your elders, past and present, and very happy to be here. I thank the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, and also Kristen, despite the sledge. And just wanted to note some friends, of course, in the audience, particularly my friends from the Victorian Federation of Traditional Owners, and in particular Janine Coombs, who's a really close friend of mine who has been such a great support and collaborator, both with the dialogues here in Victoria and also at Uluru, which was a really special thing to share. And also just note also my other friend Jill Gallagher, who's not here today. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I've been asked to deliver the 2018 Human Rights Oration in 12 font. That's the other thing that went wrong. My eyesight's really bad. And we kept sending it to Qantas to print out in 14, but it wouldn't. So it's in 12 font, but we'll see how I go. The only other person I've seen who reads their speeches in such large font was Quentin Bryce, who had it at 16. So we're both like, can't see anything. But so today I will speak about the journey toward treaty, 1 year on from the Uluru Statement. And I want to say something today about the exigency of the national reform agenda set down by First Nations last year through the Referendum Council. This agenda we broadly call the Uluru Reforms, or Voice, Treaty, Truth, and connect that to the really important work that's being done in Victoria, the pioneering work, historic work towards a treaty with Victoria's First Peoples. So I want to effectively do 4 things. I want to begin by reflecting on the years and decades leading up to Uluru, because the experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people throughout the years are inextricably linked to the reforms of voice, treaty and truth. And in doing so, I'll draw upon a framework of what's known as ethical loneliness to convey this important, I think, experience that informs Uluru, that comes from the state listening but not hearing. Secondly, I raise this ethical loneliness because this failure to hear informed the design of the Referendum Council dialogues. So we deliberately chose the process of dialogue and the language of dialogue, and they were set up in a particular way in order to not just listen, but also to hear. Then I want to explain the sequencing of the Uluru reforms at that national level, because I think that it's important to understand that, and they very much mirror the approach that is being taken here in Victoria. And then finally, I wanted to end, as all constitutional lawyers do, by raising some challenges of treaty making across the Federation. So an uncoordinated pursuit of treaty across the Federation does create a quandary for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I want to talk a little bit about some of those important red flags to keep in mind. So to begin with, I want to talk about this concept of ethical loneliness. I was a member of the Referendum Council that developed and designed these dialogues that led to the historic consensus at Uluru and the issuing of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is more than just the first page. People think it's just one page, but it's actually 18 pages. So if you go to the Referendum Council's report, you will see that the Uluru Statement from the Heart includes the very important statement that we issued to the Australian people at Uluru, but it also includes a very important story that we called Our Story, that maps Aboriginal history through Aboriginal eyes, starting with invasion and traversing many of the phases of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history, including the important stories that Arnie Zita was telling about reserves and missions and that protection, or benignly known as protection era. I would say that compulsory period of enforced racial segregation. So I would urge you all to look at that full Uluru Statement. So I was a member of the council and I was the chair of the subcommittee that was tasked with this job of setting up these dialogues to consult with our communities. And there were a number of concerns that I had in designing those dialogues. One of the primary concerns I had in developing the process was that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are frequently consulted, almost over-consulted by every single level of government, local, state and federal, either by bureaucrats or by the professional consultants to which the bureaucracy outsourced much of its core work to. How are communities going to receive us coming to speak to them about constitutional recognition when there's so much noise going on in communities? I was also conscious that over the years, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been consulted on structural reform, big picture reform, and have almost always been ignored. So we do know, and we spoke about this through the dialogues, that really significant developments in Aboriginal rights in Australia have come as a consequence of activism, or through the courts. But they've never really come as a consequence of Parliament doing things because it should, or because it's persuaded, or because it's the right thing to do. So most of our rights have come through activism or through litigation. So we were concerned then that there'd been endless processes that told us what meaningful constitutional recognition might mean to communities. And I refer to processes such as the Council for Aboriginal Reconciliation or the ATSIC Social Justice Package. And that social justice package is the third arm of the Mabo settlement. And that third arm has never been implemented by the Commonwealth Government. So our mob willingly and in good faith participate in law reform processes to improve Australian democracy, but rarely is there substantive structural reform. So at the time of designing these dialogues, I was in particular worried by the Hansard transcripts of a joint select parliamentary committee that had been set up in 2013 after an expert panel on the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in the Constitution. And if you read the transcripts of the committee going out to visit communities and talk about recognition, recognition was not what communities wanted to talk about. And there was a really palpable sense of voicelessness and powerlessness in these transcripts. I mean, these hearings were 10 years post-ATSIC, and they were during the rollout of the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, which I'll come to later. So as a public lawyer, what I was reading in these transcripts concerned me greatly. And of course, as an academic, I did a lot of research into voicelessness and powerlessness. How do you address that? Both structurally in terms of constitutional law, but also in terms of philosophy and ethics, because we wanted to design a process that would engage our mob without people feeling, used, or that it wouldn't lead to anything. But also in terms of looking at philosophical and ethical kind of frameworks of powerlessness and voicelessness, we were concerned that if so many communities feel abandoned by the structures of the state, by Australian democracy, then structurally this has to have an impact upon people's health and well-being. One study that I considered in the course of the design of the dialogues was a study called Ethical Loneliness, the Injustice of Not Being Heard, by an American scholar, Jill Stauffer. And it's loosely based on interviews with ex-interns, Jewish in terms of concentration camps. Stauffer's research was of particular interest to me. And when she talks about ethical loneliness, she's not talking about loneliness as in solitude, of course. She's speaking about the experience of having been abandoned by humanity, compounded by the experience of not being heard. So she defines ethical loneliness in the following way. Ethical loneliness is the isolation one feels when one, as a violated person or as one member of a persecuted group, has been abandoned by humanity or by those who have power over one's life's possibilities. It is a condition undergone by persons who have been unjustly treated and dehumanised by human beings and political structures, who emerge from that injustice only to find that the surrounding world will not listen to or cannot properly hear their testimony, their claims about what they have suffered and about what is now owed to them on their own terms. So ethical loneliness is the experience of having been abandoned by humanity, compounded by the experience of not being heard. This form of loneliness is widespread, that it is caused not only by dehumanisation, oppression and abandonment, but also, and this is important, by the failure of just-minded people to hear well from those who have suffered what recovery or reconciliation after massive violence or long-standing injustice would require. And I think there's something in that in terms of post-Uluru. Post-Uluru, here you have a group of people saying, well, this is what's required. This is what the site of reconciliation looks like, the start of that journey looks like. And there was absolutely a failure to hear. Stauffer says that such failures of hearing haunt sites where the goal is political transition, reconciliation or forgiveness. And as such, unassuaged ethical loneliness has very serious political ramifications. And I think it is true to say that it has had serious political ramifications for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia. See, and I say this a lot, reconciliation is about truth and justice. And I frequently say that I feel like Australia wants to jump over the truth part and the justice part and just get to the reconciliation part. So we just want to skip the difficult part, the truth, listening and hearing the testimony of those who have suffered and how they think amends should be made. Sorry, I thought I could hold off. So I do believe that the failure to hear what Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are saying has really dominated the constitutional recognition process, and I'm going to explain why. Before I explain why, I have to say that it's really important to keep in mind that when the Victorian government went to communities to say, we're going to consult on constitutional recognition, communities said, no, we want to negotiate a treaty. And I thought that is a really, and the fact that the government said yes and are now involved in this process, I think that was a really important turning point in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander relations, not just in Victoria, but in the country. And I'll explain why. So we have this recognition process. It's been formally going from 2011 to now. So that's 8 years. We've had 5 mechanisms in 8 years. We've had a Prime Minister's expert panel. We've had a review, the Anderson Review, led by John Anderson. We've had a Joint Select Parliamentary Committee on recognition. We've had another Prime Minister's Referendum Council. And now we have a second Joint Select Parliamentary Committee. So these mechanisms have produced 6 reports in 8 years. And by the end of this year, with the Second Joint Select Committee reporting in November, we will have had 8 reports in 8 years on recognition. Let that sink in. There's a lot of listening, but there's a massive gross failure to hear. So why is this so? I've spent a lot of time thinking about this because, of course, I was involved in the expert panel and the referendum council, and my job is as a constitutional lawyer. What we know is that recognition is a really complex political term and a complex legal term. So if you were to search it on a university library database, it will come up with volumes and volumes of material and PhD, thesis and books and articles on recognition. So it's complex. So its dictionary meaning is acknowledgement, but in political and legal theory, it's very complex. So it can mean acknowledgement or symbolic acknowledgement, but it can also mean substantive reform to power relations. It's a spectrum. At one end you have weak recognition, which is basically symbolism. We call it weak because it doesn't compel anyone to do anything. It doesn't compel the state to do anything. It doesn't compel government to do anything. And at this end, the strong end, strong form recognition, we have things like treaty agreements, autonomous regions, perhaps designated seats, a multitude of forms of recognition that compels the state to do something. And that was really important about Uluru. People didn't want to be down this end, they wanted to be at that end. They wanted to compel the Australian state to do things. So recognition is a complex term, and the expert panel did, in 2012, when it handed its report in January to the Prime Minister, recommend structural reform through a non-discrimination clause. But the public debate from 2012 to 2015, almost 4 years in Australia, rarely rose above the threshold of the dictionary meaning of recognition, which was acknowledgement and symbolism. That's not to say that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't aware that that was going on, but media, who tend not to be very forensic at all in their reporting on Aboriginal affairs anymore, and politicians really hadn't paid any attention. And at least by the time we got to Uluru, it was very clear that very few in the media and very few in the political class or politicians had actually read any of the reports over the past 7 years. So recognition rarely rose above this notion of symbolism or acknowledgement. So this was very unsettling for the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. And in fact, if you follow Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander social media or media, you would know that there was a backlash, including a backlash against the government-funded campaign that was set up to educate the Australian community on recognition, known as Recognise. So what do I mean by minimal or symbolic recognition? We often refer to it as constitutional housekeeping, but the minimalist form of constitutional recognition would be something like the deletion of Section 25 in the Constitution, the moderation of the race power, or deletion of the race power and its replacement with a new head of power, and thirdly, a statement of recognition. So we urged, by about mid-2015, Tony Abbott to set up a new process. We said that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities were rejecting what we think was their preferred form of recognition, minimalist symbolic recognition, and that what people wanted was substantive reform. What Abbott did was hold a meeting in 2015 with 40 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders from across the country. So the Prime Minister and the opposition leader were there at Kirribilli, and they issued this statement: any reform must involve substantive changes to the Australian Constitution. It must lay the foundation for the fair treatment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples into the future. A minimalist approach that provides preambular recognition, removes Section 25 and moderates the race power does not go far enough and would not be acceptable to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So this is 2015. It's very, very clear where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities stand at that point. I make that point too because as later we know there was a lot of pearl clutching post Uluru, a lot of political elite saying, well, what happened? This was so unexpected. Well, no, it wasn't unexpected. You just don't listen and you certainly don't hear. So that statement was issued and the Kirribilli leaders recommended that another process needed to be implemented. So, fortunately, Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull did form a referendum council. He wasn't persuaded because he was told by his bureaucracy that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had been over-consulted on recognition and that they wanted to move to a referendum. But fortunately, he did set up the council, of which I was a part, although I'm pretty sure he didn't want me on it. Someone else threatened to resign if I wasn't on it. That's the only reason I got there. So we got the referendum council up and we said to the full referendum council, look, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people haven't been over-consulted. This is a big myth that you're telling yourself in Canberra. What we need to do is go out and actually ask people, what is meaningful recognition to you? They are not going to cop the 25, they're not going to cop the statement of recognition, and they're not going to cop moderation of the race power. Also, neither the expert panel nor the Joint Select Committee or any other process had properly asked Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people what they wanted. And as I've said on multiple occasions, in a recognition exercise between the state and First Peoples, you need, I mean, it's a pretty obvious thing, right? But you do need the to be recognised to agree with the form of recognition. And I know that sounds funny, but really we were very, very concerned mid-2015 that they would go to a referendum without our agreement. I'd heard multiple times in political circles that people didn't need the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander vote to get the referendum across the line because of our numbers. So this meant then that the dialogues were really important. How do you now go out to communities and talk to them about constitutional reform and what is meaningful constitutional reform when consultation is a dirty word in most communities, mostly because of the lack of meaningful consultation that is done in a lot of communities, particularly by local, state and federal governments. So we decided that what we would do is design a structured, deliberative dialogue process where we'd walk a sample of representatives of First Nations around the country through a very tightly structured process that involved civics, an intensive civics program, an intensive legal lecture, and an assessment of legal options for reform. So those legal reforms we took out were agreed to by the Prime Minister and Opposition Leader. So because of what was going on in Victoria, we had to include agreement making. We said that would be the elephant in the room if we went out to communities and didn't talk about agreement making. The second reform that the Prime Minister and Opposition Leader agreed to was the voice to Parliament. So to begin with, in terms of settling the dialogue structure, we sought permission at 3 pre-meetings. We had a meeting in Broome with a sample of traditional owners from across Australia and the Torres Strait. We had a meeting on Thursday Island with key leaders from Aboriginal organisations and national peaks. And then we had a meeting with leaders, individual leaders in the movement in Melbourne, where we ran that dialogue process by everyone. In addition to that, we ran a trial dialogue in Melbourne at Melbourne Law School. And the trial dialogue was where we brought all of the regions in, all of the facilitators who would participate in the dialogues so that they themselves could participate in at least one dialogue. And we didn't call them facilitators, but I'll get to that. So the Referendum Council gave final approval to the dialogue process, and then we rolled them out over about 6 or 7 months. So the First Nations regional dialogues were convened in Hobart by the Tasmanian Aboriginal Corporation, in Broome by the Kimberley Land Council, in Dubbo by the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, in Darwin by the Northern Land Council, in Perth by the South West Aboriginal Land and Sea Council, in Sydney by the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council, in Melbourne by the Federation of Victorian Traditional Owners Corporation, in Cairns by the North Queensland Land Council, in Ross River by the Central Land Council, in Adelaide by the Aboriginal Legal Rights Movement, in Brisbane by a number of organisations, and Thursday Island, the Torres Strait Regional Authority, the Torres Strait Council, and a number of other Torres Strait regional organisations. We held a truncated version of the dialogue in Canberra with United Ngunnawal Elders Council. And then, of course, the Uluru National Constitutional Convention was held about a year ago, last year. So just a few key elements of the dialogues. We engaged IATSIS to run it, so it wouldn't be top-down, it wouldn't be us doing it. It would be IATSIS engaging local orgs, and those organisations, mostly land councils, would run the dialogue for us, including choosing the invitation list. The invitation list was really important because we had a kind of formula that it needed to be 60% of participants were traditional owners, that 20% would be drawn from Aboriginal organisations, local Aboriginal orgs, and another 20% would be interested Indigenous or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, so grannies and elders, young people, stolen generations. So it was really important to us that 60% of the invitation list was traditional owners because it was important that the dialogues were led by the cultural authority around the country. We didn't want any professional facilitators, and the word facilitator was banned. And we didn't want any non-Indigenous facilitators. It had to be community-led. So everybody who participated in that process, the people who led the breakout groups or the plenary groups, they had to be local people. And we used local people because the local people know local conditions and know each other. So that was really important to us. We had fundamental principles that I think guided the dialogues and the way that they were run. Impartiality, accessibility of relevant information. So we had both written material and DVD form, open and constructive dialogue, and mutually agreed and owned outcomes. So the end of each dialogue saw the group agree on a record of meetings, so everybody signed off on what had been prioritised in terms of law reform. So we feel really strongly then that the outcome at Uluru, the consensus at Uluru, was a testament to the efficacy of this structured process. And it allowed the wisdom and intent of the representatives of the First Nations regional dialogues to coalesce in a common position. That was really important to us, this notion of listening and hearing. We chose dialogue for a number of reasons. It comes from the Greek word dialogos. Logos means the word, or in our case, the meaning of the word. And dia means through. It doesn't mean to. So in particular, we were influenced by, a number of writings on dialogues, but in particular, David Boehm's writing on dialogues. We liked his crucial difference between dialogue and discussion. He said a dialogue can be among any number of people, not just two. Even one person can have a sense of a dialogue within himself if the spirit of the dialogue is present. The picture or image that this derivation suggests is of a stream of meaning flowing among and through us and between us. This will make possible a flow of meaning in the whole group out of which may emerge some new understanding. It's something new which may not have been in the starting point at all. It's something creative, and this shared meaning is the glue or the cement that holds people and societies together. And I use that quote because that's where the truth-telling come from. That came from our mob through this dialogue process. It was not something that the opposition leader or the Prime Minister agreed to. It was something that every single dialogue said without even knowing each other's record of meeting across the country, was that the truth-telling process was one of the meaningful forms of recognition. Bohm says, contrast this word dialogue with discussion, which has the same root as percussion and concussion. It really means to break things up. It emphasises the idea of analysis, where there may be many points of view and where everybody is presenting a different one, analysing and breaking up. That obviously has its value, but it is limited, and it will not get us very far beyond our various points of view. Discussion is almost like a ping-pong game, where people are batting the ideas back and forth, and the object of the game is to win or get points for yourself. He says, in a dialogue, however, nobody is trying to win. Everybody wins if anybody wins. There is a different sort of spirit to it. In a dialogue, there is no attempt to gain points or to make your particular view prevail. Rather, whenever any mistake is discovered on the part of anybody, everybody gains. It's a situation called win-win, whereas the other game, discussion, is win-lose. If I win, you lose. But a dialogue is something more of a common participation in which we are not playing a game against each other, but with each other. In a dialogue, everybody wins. And I think that very much informs the spirit of what happened in the dialogues. Uluru, once we got to Yulara, the National Constitutional Convention, Uluru was not a decision-making forum. So it was not up to the people elected at the dialogues to change what had happened in the dialogues. Uluru signed off on and rubber-stamped what had been done in the dialogues. It was really important for us to go to Uluru and say, look at this incredible amount of work these people have done in 13 regions. This is what they say they want, voice treaty truth. This is what they've said is the history, our shared history of Aboriginal Australia, and at Uluru that was signed off on, in addition to the very important Uluru Statement from the Heart, which of course we issued to the Australian people and not to politicians, not to the Prime Minister and opposition leader, because we knew that there's no way you will get this kind of really sophisticated reform up by relying on just politicians and the parliamentary process alone. It has to be a people's movement. So just in the time remaining, I want to move on to the Uluru reforms and the journey to treaty. Uluru was a sequence reform, voice to the Parliament first, treaty second, which isn't dissimilar to what's happened in Victoria and the Victorian treaty process. Treaty has always been the primary aspiration of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander movement. And I think this is probably what confused some people post-referendum council when the dialogues, or Uluru did rubber stamp this enshrined voice to Parliament as the principal reform that comes first. We witnessed so many non-Indigenous allies transform overnight from conservative recognised champions of symbolism and incrementalism to the most radical treaty now people, taking advantage of the heavy lifting done by the dialogues and Uluru to cherry-pick the reform. Yet, in talking with many of these newly converted treaty champions who were once telling me to just go with symbolism, they can't tell you how it would be done and who it would be done with and what resources communities have now and what resources communities will need, and how the power imbalance is to be addressed, particularly when so many First Nations have no leverage. The constitutional dialogues did think deeply about these questions, and they thought deeply about these questions based on a realistic picture of where communities are now. And they did, because they are the communities. They know what's going on in their own communities. So this is what we heard. And you can't understand Uluru and the Voice to Parliament as the first step in the sequence without understanding the following. First is the Indigenous Advancement Strategy. The Indigenous Advancement Strategy was a strategy that was introduced in about 2014 by the new Abbott government. It was a policy in which they took all of the money across the Commonwealth bureaucracy and put it into one bucket. And in doing that, they defunded a lot of organisations, but a lot of really important programs and policies that had been in existence since even the 70s. And they couldn't tell you what had been defunded because they just took a razor to everything. Then, once that money was in that bucket, they asked people to reapply for their money. And what we saw was communities across the country really struggle with a complicated online application process. Not all communities have, great Wi-Fi or internet connection, if any. Not all communities have the resources to be able to do those really complex submissions for money. And that's why we saw the bulk of the money, we now know, going to non-Indigenous organisations. So they went to a lot of not-for-profits and a lot of corporates, including corporates with RAPs. So they got money from the bucket of money to fund their reconciliation action plans. So after the destruction wrought by the Indigenous Advancement Strategy, communities were unsurprisingly, unequivocally attracted to a voice to Parliament. I spoke about the Hansard records from the Joint Select Committee in 2013 and 14, the palpable sense of voicelessness and powerlessness. The impact of the advancement strategy, it dominated considerations of constitutional recognition. So the Australian National Audit Office found that the IAS, which saw the bulk of this money in non-Indigenous hands, was planned and designed by the Abbott government in 7 weeks. So 7 weeks it took to unravel the last vestiges of self-determination, started in around 1975. The Audit Office found that the Prime Minister and Cabinet's PMNC's grants administration processes fell short of the standard that is required to effectively manage $1 billion of Commonwealth resources. And as asserted by many communities at the time, the reason for losing your funding was not communicated to them. The National Audit Office found that the basis by which projects were recommended to the Minister was not clear, and the department did not assess applications in a manner that was consistent with the guidelines and department's public statements, and they did not keep records of key decisions. What's really important to know there too is that if you were an Aboriginal org and you submitted your form and it was incomplete, they would send it back or not look at it. But there are multiple examples shown in the Australian newspaper and then by the Audit Office of non-Indigenous orgs submitting incomplete forms and still receiving money. So this is what really occupied a lot of, I think, the decision-making around prioritising a voice to Parliament. As Noel Pearson told the Australian newspaper, most Australians have no idea that the greatest beneficiaries of investment of Indigenous funds are non-Indigenous organisations not based in the communities in whose name the expenditure has been justified by Parliament. So this is the great national mythology, right, that the Aboriginal industry benefits Aboriginal people. It doesn't. And you can't understand Uluru, and you can't understand the sequence reform without understanding the policy environment from 2014 to 2017. So if you think about the expert panel in 2012, it recommended a non-discrimination clause and to amend the race power, and then people at Uluru were like, what happened to the race power? Well, listen to what the dialogues are saying. So much changed from 2012 to 2017. So much has changed. So native title was one of the other reasons I think that the voice was so important as a first step in terms of agreement making. So as I said, the primary aspiration of any community is normally some form of settlement with the state. But what we did here was stories from communities, almost in every region, about the way in which native title had torn communities and families apart. So there's some regions that haven't had the worst experience with that. I noticed in Broome, there was a kind of fatigue with agreement making. But that certainly wasn't the case in all the other regions. So what we did here, interestingly, is a call for dispute resolution services in communities before agreement making could occur. People were saying we need to talk with each other and learn to talk with each other again before we can enter into agreement making with the state. We heard complaints about different land governance structures. The situation on the ground is very, very complex. And Australia is a federal system, of course. Dialogues discussed how coordination across the Commonwealth was essential for any treaty-making era. Virtually all dialogues agreed that agreements needed to be made with multiple First Nations, not a single pan-Aboriginal national treaty in which nations are subsumed by a reductionist concept of cultural authority. The sequencing is therefore important. And then thirdly, in terms of the voice, most other liberal democracies have some sort of voice to Parliament. This is not rocket science. It's so pedestrian. It's so conventional in other parts of the world. I can't believe it is such a big deal. It's certainly not a third chamber. But if you look across the country, and with my UN hat on, if I think about the 70-odd nations with significant Indigenous populations across the world, all of them have some form of either institutional voice or some duty to consult. But by and large, there is some form or some way to compel the state to listen to what people are saying about law and policy. So having a voice matters. And the other dialogue innovation, I think, which is really important, is that this voice is not another ATSIC. It won't be a traditional Western Liberal Democratic election structure because it's a First Nations voice. It is collective rights that are paramount. It is the First Nation who decides who represents them. The idea was this was about returning decision-making to the cultural authority across the country. So rather than national peaks in Canberra or other people who lobby government in Canberra, this is about returning decision-making back to communities, because it's communities, First Nations, who understand their communities better or most. So that's a little bit about the sequence. So just to finish, because I'm on 42 minutes and I was given 40, but I'm sure I'm really over, I wanted to raise a few things as a constitutional lawyer on treaty. So the treaty process in Victoria is really important, and already it's eliciting really important lessons for the rest of the country. Where there's Commonwealth inertia, and there's a lot of Commonwealth inertia, it's important that the states innovate. And Victoria is in the middle of a very historic process, although very complex process. So I make these comments broadly across the Federation. It's not directed at Victoria. So we've seen wildly oscillating definitions of treaty emerge in Australia during this kind of burgeoning treaty discussion. So while we are experienced in agreement making, Australia is green when it comes to treaty making, which isn't surprising because we're retrofitting that which should have been done at first contact. So one caution is bureaucrats and self-determination. So having Indigenous departments and bureaucrats direct traffic for negotiations on both sides of an agreement is a red flag. It immediately places communities on the back foot. Self-determination, the way that bureaucracies talk about self-determination these days. So across the Federation, we're hearing of bureaucracies seeking to embed in treaty agreements their policies that are often misguidedly characterised as the right to self-determination. So self-determination at the end of the ATSIC era, for example, meant maybe regional autonomy in some places, and they were certainly moving towards that before ATSIC was abolished. But over a decade on, we've allowed self-determination to be legally misshapen into a mantra of doing things with communities, not doing things to communities, which in my view is an extraordinary jettisoning of a purposefully emancipatory normative framework. We should be getting bureaucracies just out. A senior bureaucrat actually has said to me that we don't need structural reform because mob aren't powerless. We have power within. So we're entering a phase of state and territory treaty making at a time when the bureaucracy's penchant for New Age philosophy, mob finding the power within as opposed to power and structures, it's really problematic. I know it's funny, but it's not. It's really problematic. Structural reform to address structural power imbalance is a conventional way of tempering powerlessness for Indigenous populations in liberal democracies. To talk about powerlessness and voicelessness is not to deficit discourse or to strip people of agency. It is to identify the problems with the structure. That's how conventional law reform is done. We know our people have inner strength and are resilient, but we're not talking about personal or cultural power. We're talking about structural power, and even agency needs structure. Treaty is, or should be, unapologetically about exiting bureaucrats from Indigenous affairs, not entrenching the power imbalance. So following on from that, I want to make another point, the current structural arrangements. So treaties are foundational constitutional agreements between First Nations and the state, and they do involve a redistribution of political power. Treaties are agreements aimed at settling fundamental grievances and agreeing to binding frameworks of future engagement and dispute resolution. Treaties are legal texts. There will be disputes over interpretation. But treaties are not blank canvases for governments to embed power imbalance of the status quo. Consider this from the Northern Territory government, who recently signed a memorandum of understanding on a treaty in that jurisdiction. Instead of a one-off reparation paid out for past injustices and for Aboriginal land and resources, a treaty could mean that government provides money for educational housing and the community takes responsibility for how it is delivered. Treaties are not service delivery agreements, although they might be a component of that. But treaties are about reparations for past injustice, and they are about land, and they are about resources. Any government fencing in a bread and butter treaty inventory at an MOU stage is a red flag. So some key risks are a culture, once entrenched, is very difficult to disrupt. So the trends, how Victoria does their work, that precedent is likely to set a precedent for the rest of the country. But we can't allow the current power imbalance to be embedded in a treaty. And we can't let a treaty be led by the low threshold of rights recognition in Australia. So the next risk is our federal system. There are risks with an uncoordinated approach to treaty making. The idea behind this Makarrata Commission was that we can gather resources, so precedents. It's really important to capture how it is that Victoria's got to this point. Every single element, every single person needs to be interviewed so that everybody who's involved in this in the future across the country can draw on that. So resources are really important. In addition to very important fast-tracking of land settlement, including native title. The jurisdiction with the biggest risk in the Federation is the Northern Territory, because it's a territory. Gumatj leader Galarrwuy Yunupingu called this out at the treaty MOU signing in Barunga. He said, "None of the land councils can tell me anything about treaty. What does the word treaty mean? Nothing. It means nothing to your new people. The men offering us the word treaty, will it be nice or will it be no good? It has to be the federal government and not just only the Northern Territory government." Jeff Shaw, who was a former head of the Tarntine Council and was at the original Barunga, also said, "Without constitutional reform, the treaty talks would be meaningless. The strength is within the Constitution." The last point I'll make before concluding is community expectations. We need to manage the titanic expectations that come with utopian ideals of treaty. Treaties are legal agreements. Treaty is not an end, it's a beginning. Other jurisdictions in the world show us that post-treaty making can be messy and legalistic. So the voice to Parliament is not an original idea. It is as old as the calls for treaties. Aboriginal peoples as an extreme minority have always sought an enhanced role in decision-making in Australian democracy. So the sequence of voice and then treaty is an appropriate one. We need an interface between communities and the state. We need an institutional framework with resources and legitimacy. While a treaty is the primary aspiration of most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, a recognition of our ancient sovereignties in Australia, a voice also speaks to the state's routine failure to hear what it is that we are saying. And so to conclude, I would say that the recognition project till now has been absolutely a spectacular case study in the state's failure to hear, and in that I include Malcolm Turnbull's rejection of all of the Uluru forms last year. But the recognition process has also inadvertently provided the Indigenous polity with renewed confidence to argue for a politically negotiated settlement that allows them to settle these grievances and to design a peaceful path forward. Victoria is a case in mind. A state government seeks community views on constitutional recognition, and the community eschews that recognition for a treaty. The renewed vigour for a settlement with the Australian nation neatly aligns with the Old Testament scholar Walter Brueggemann's version of hope, which I believe best reflects the current mood of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community in its ambivalence about state-willed recognition symbolism in favour of something more meaningful and more durable. He says, hope, on the one hand, is an absurdity, too embarrassing to speak about, for it flies in the face of all those claims we have been told are facts. Hope is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. And one does that only at great political and existential risk. On the other hand, hope is subversive, for it limits the grandiose pretension of the present, daring to announce that the present to which we all have made commitments is now called into question. And that is what I believe Uluru represents. That is what I believe the Victorian process represents. It represents the hope against hope that we could push for a comprehensive settlement, a Makarrata process finally, voice, treaty and truth. Thank you.